Today we're going to look at a much more interesting topic, still in line with my previous discussion regarding the Civil War. This time around, I actually want to talk about a rare concept called saboteurs. What is the meaning of a saboteur? Now, basically, a saboteur is one who intentionally damages something and prevents one from achieving anything. Interestingly, the word saboteur was actually introduced into our own lexicon during the Civil War. The word itself became an issue at the initial stage of the Nigerian Civil War. It gained popularity especially among the secessionist side, meaning the Biafrans. To them, a saboteur is one who intentionally sabotages the war effort, who intentionally destroys any effort to prevent the East from making any headway during the war. The Chief of Army Staff of Biafra, Brigadier Alexander Madiebo, in his book The Nigerian Revolution and the Biafran War, chapter 8 actually talked about saboteurs and the politics of saboteurs. Now he led the Biafran army into diverse operations from the onset of the war till the end of the war. And so he had very insightful knowledge about saboteurs, or what they actually meant. And why did it actually gain popularity, especially among the Biafrans? Now, when the war broke out on the 6th of July 1967 at Garkim in present-day Bekwara local government area of Cross River State, the Biafran High Command actually noticed a rare trend during the war. And what was that? A certain Lieutenant Colonel Banjo and Major Alele were actually the first to actually mention the word saboteurs within the then Biafran 53rd Brigade. Their view was that whenever any plan, the Biafrans plan any operation, 30 minutes to the H hour of that operation, according to them, the enemy federal forces will not only launch an attack that moment, but will take certain steps that depicts that they had certain information about their operations. Interestingly, that particular notion, and for the fact that it became popular, especially among the Biafrans, was the foundational reason why the Biafrans lost the war. Because even innocent people who had nothing to do with it, but were simply perceived as an enemy, were tagged saboteurs. Brigadier Banjo, Major Emmanuel Ifejuna, Major Sam Alele, and Major Philip not only tried and executed, but they were accused of being saboteurs. Now, while people now thought that the monster had been taken off, it became an issue among the Biafran officers. It was so deadly that any officer who failed to carry out any operation is not only booted, but in some cases, they lose their lives. It became an issue across the entire Biafran formations. Now, that wasn't the end of things. Who were perceived to be non-Igbos were simply tagged saboteurs, especially when the Nigerian 3rd Marine Commando had an easy run across the non-Igbo speaking territories. The non-Igbos in the east, as at the time, were simply perceived and accused as saboteurs. A good number of them were arrested, incarcerated, tortured, and killed. Now, here's the most interesting part. Even through this moment, the non-Igbo speakers in the old monolithic eastern region are jokingly actually called saboteurs, sabo. But what nobody will actually talk about is the fact that a house divided against itself can never stand. Aside the non-Igbo speakers who were perceived as saboteurs, and the fundamental reason why the Biafrans lost the war, the other angle nobody has failed to talk about is that the ant that destroys the vegetable is within the vegetable itself. What do I really mean? From the beginning of the war until the end of the war, from the first gunshot that was fired at Gakim, until the last operation that ended the war at the Owerri sector of the war, the Biafran High Command, the Biafran operation, the Biafran men, women that fought the war, the weapons used were largely inadequate. That is the number one saboteur. That is the number one sabotage. That you're starting a war that you are fundamentally not prepared for. That is the first scale, the first grand scale of sabotage. The second is that those who were actually given monies to procure arms and ammunition for the Biafran cause vanished with that money. Otto Nwankwo, in his own book, The Challenges of Biafra, elucidated lots of actions by Biafrans themselves that eventually led to the collapse of Biafra. The number of men who lost their lives to starvation caused by poor distribution and corruption within the army itself were more than those who actually fell in actual combat. These are grand levels of sabotage. Uniforms that were supposed to be given to fighting men were never given to them at all. A good number of Biafran soldiers fought as ragtag soldiers, poorly kitted and poorly equipped. And whose fault? Somebody was responsible for that. And that person not only did not deliver, but simply diverted such monies for that purpose. Those are grand level of sabotage. What greater level of sabotage would you actually want to call that one? And then, the fact that there is mutual suspicion, even among officers and soldiers, during the war. There was this that of camaraderie. There was mutual suspicion. There was rivalry among the different fighting units. There was poor coordination. Those are ground levels of sabotage and saboteurs. Letting the world know that no force in Black Africa can subdue you. Letting the world know that there's a build-up of arms and ammunition when none of that ever existed is the highest level of sabotage. And then I hear people now say, well, Philip Effiong was the 2IC to Ojukwu. N.U. Akpan was the secretary to the government of Biafra. Franco Pigu suggested the name Biafra. And lots of non-Igbo speakers actually held commanding positions or influential positions in Biafra. And despite that, the people refused to support the Biafran cause. These people I just mentioned had little to do with deciding the position of their own people. That Philip Effiong was a 2IC to Ojukwu, and Franco Pigo suggested the name, and N.U. Akpan was the secretary. That does not in any way meant that the entire non-Igbo speakers would simply support the Biafran cause. Given the fact that the rivalry and the bickering had long existed before the outbreak of the war. When Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe could not form a government in the West, came back to the East, removed the Professor Eyoita, who was already the leader of government business in the East, and replaced him with a Dr. Michael Okpara. That, to me, was the last straw that broke the camel's back. Because that cord of friendship and brotherhood that would have existed, that existed even before that time, was broken. And there was really no way the non-Igbos would likely want to forge a cause with the people who consider them as second class. So we want to actually talk about sabotage or saboteurs. You need to look at it holistically. That the non-Igbo speakers did not give the full support, though, according to Ralph Okwechime, Ralph Okwechime's Reflections of the Nigerian Civil War, while thousands fought for Biafra, the non-Igbos, tens of thousands fought against it. So it meant that yes, there were some non-Igbos who actually supported the Biafran cause, but the greater majority fought against it. They had their reasons. They were not saboteurs. The long-standing relationship that existed prior to the war, from 1951, when Nnamdi Azikiwe removed Eyoita and replaced him with Dr. Michael Okpara, that was the beginning of the downfall of Biafra. Because if that never happened, the friendship, the brotherhood, the bond that existed prior to that time would have made the entire East to fight as a bloc. And that unity would have made Biafra to survive. And so when people talk about saboteurs or sabotage, you need to understand that the non-Igbo speakers did not sabotage the effort. They were simply defending their own interest. An interest that was not protected ab initio. An interest that ought to have been discussed. The grievances that ought to have been sorted out long before that time. Those were their issues. Prior to the war, the agitation was state creation. State creation, the agitation for state creation started in the East. Especially when Eyoita was removed as head of government business in the East and replaced with Dr. Michael Okpara. That agitation for state creation was the beginning of the downfall of Biafra. So Biafra itself failed, was a failed project even from the beginning. It was a failed project ab initio. If that had not happened, then Biafra would have succeeded. Because a good number of non-Igbo speakers also suffered the same fate. Easterners, both Igbos and non-Igbos, were targeted. In the north, and both Igbos and non-Igbo speakers relocated back to the east as at the time. But the question is, how comes, despite the fact that non-Igbo speakers were targeted and affected and also relocated back to the east, a good number still felt that some kind of association should be made between the Igbos, but not to form a political entity? That was the agitation. Those were their grievances. And so when somebody tells you that they are the saboteurs, they were never the saboteurs. In short, a good number of them fought for Biafra. A greater number fought against Biafra. So they were never saboteurs. The greatest sabotage was the fact that those who actually conceived, those who actually planned the operations of that war failed ab initio because they were not fundamentally prepared for that war. They lacked the basic weapons to prosecute that war. That is the greatest sabotage. Not admitting to the fact that you're not prepared for something, and you instead went ahead for it. When you fail to plan, then you plan to fail. And then when people are given monies to get arms and ammunition to prosecute the war, and they could not, and they vanish with that money, that is the second level of sabotage. The third level of sabotage was mutual suspicion. Even among Igbos, some Igbo officers lost their lives during the war on mere accusation of being saboteurs. So a house already is very against itself. And then the last court that should have assisted in that war were the non-Igbo speakers, who were also targeted, incarcerated, tortured, and killed as the last level of sabotage. So, when people talk about sabotage, you should understand that it was a multi-dimensional and multi-level problem, and not just merely the accusation of a people as saboteurs. There was administrative sabotage. There was operational sabotage. There was cultural sabotage. There was historical sabotage. There's no way that Biafra could have succeeded when Biafra itself had its own fundamental issues to deal with prior to the war. Like I said, the ant that destroys the vegetable is within the vegetable itself. And a house divided against itself cannot stand. Please like and share.